Hey, I wanted to welcome everyone tonight to tonight's American Shoulder and Elbow Surgeons Research webinar series. We've been now running this series for about 2 years or so, and I've been lucky to be running this with my co-moderator, Peter Simon, and we've been going over various aspects of both clinical and basics research topics that hopefully have been helpful to the members of the society to be able to allow them to write, produce, and hopefully and publish research that is maybe at a higher quality or level than maybe has been previously published. And this will help us not only with grants, but also with some of the awards that we've been giving out over the years. So tonight's topic is going to be going over a practical guide to paper publication, and this was actually I have to give Peter credit with regards to this topic because he was the one who actually came up with it. And so how we've broken it down is that we're going to have three different experts in this area go over various aspects of paper publication. The first is going to be Greg Satanovich, who's from Ohio State University. Greg's going to talk about the perspective from the author, how to write a paper and get it published from the perspective of someone who's published a lot within our literature, and give helpful pearls with regards to this. The second is Serena Namdari, who's at the Rothman Institute. Serena is going to talk from the perspective of the reviewer. So he's going to give our perspective of looking at reviewing papers, what he feels is something that is high quality that he would move on to potentially making an acceptance recommendation. And then last, we're going to have Andy Green, who's at Brown in Providence, Rhode Island. And Andy's going to give us his perspective from the editor's side. Even though Serena may give a recommendation of accept or reject, Andy has to make the final decision of whether a paper should be or shouldn't be published, and what influences that decision. So that will be the flow tonight. We'll have some discussion around each of these topics, and then we'll have a little, so each will give a brief talk and then some discussion. We're going to have a small video from our sponsor, Smith & Nephew. We have to recognize them, that they've been really tremendous in being able to give us some funding to be able to support our webinar series tonight.
At Smith & Nephew, we strive to put solutions in your hands that can allow your patients to live a life unlimited, and the shoulder space is no different. Here at Smith & Nephew, our focus is on providing you options throughout your patient's continuum of care with cutting-edge products like Regenitin, a bioinductive implant that redefines biologic healing for rotator cuff tendon growth.
And the new ATOS shoulder system starring the ATOS Metastem that allows for streamlined procedures, an elevated surgical experience, and efficiency by helping to simplify TSA and RSA. We are honored to support the ASES Foundation, and it is our mission to continue to provide you with the most innovative solutions in the shoulder space to help restore your patient's ability to live their life unlimited.
Great. So again, we thank Smith & Nephew. And at this point, we will actually pull it over to Greg. And if he could pull up his slides, that would be great. And we'll get started. Thanks again, Greg. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you to Bob and Peter and everyone for the invitation. And I really look forward to learning from all of the participants with the discussion today. I certainly still have a lot to learn as an author, but I'll try to share some pearls and some of my experience. My disclosures are on the Academy website. So I was asked to talk about my experiences as an author, and sometimes it's sitting in a nice field of grass, and sometimes it's slamming your head against some error messages, but you can certainly learn a lot, and it's a very valuable part of my clinical and academic practice at Ohio State University. And I'm going to try to provide a few tips to create the manuscript and have a good chance of success. in the journal you're looking for. So my experience as an author started a few years ago. I looked back, it was about 10 years ago for JSES. I was a PGY2 resident, and I had a mid-author position publishing an article here. I had to honestly look it back up and see what we were doing at the time because it's been quite a while ago. Some of the things I learned from those early experiences was the ability to learn and work with experienced mentors. So I was a junior resident, I worked with fellows, I worked with some attendings. Matt Preventure was the lead author, and Tony Romeo. And a lot can be learned from working with other experienced authors, especially as you're newer to research and preparing publications. And some of the things I learned through this process as an author were to work with my co-authors and mentors. And this ranges all the way from the start of the research project through the manuscript preparation and beyond. And teamwork is really, really important. We obviously love the Buckeyes, but this applies to research as well. And so your team needs to work together to develop the research questions that you're seeking to answer, define the methodology, perhaps providing the resources. As a resident, you don't have the clinical volume to generate patient samples on your own. You have to work with teammate, and sometimes you need to work in a multi-center setting, a multi-center study to answer the questions that you've set forth. Depending on the study, you need funding, certainly, from sponsors or grants to make that happen. And you need the right infrastructure to do this. It's rarely possible to do solo from ground up all the way through the paper and the publication. It's important to frame your project within clinical application. This is really critical. The journals are looking for we'll hear from the editors and reviewers, but the journals, I believe, are looking for things that their readership is interested in, things that are going to impact the field and impact clinical practice. And so if you're asking a question in your publication that nobody frankly cares about, that's not going to get you as far through the submission and review process. And then after all of that, you're working on the construction, refinement of the manuscript, and finally submission. So there's a lot goes into it before you even put the pen to paper or the to the computer. So it really takes time to develop and conduct good research. And I honestly believe this is the key to a high quality publication. It really pays dividends when you go to prepare the manuscript and submit the publication. In some cases, the manuscript can really write itself if you've based it off of a good quality research study and done the work on the back end. And so this begins in the early stages with picking a research question. One format is the finer, but it gives you a framework. You want a study that's feasible. You want something that you can actually do. If you set out to do a research study and you're unable to achieve it, you don't have the expertise, you don't have the funding, you're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to even be to the point of writing a publication. It needs to be interesting. It needs to be interesting to you to spend your free time, your evenings, and your clinical time and resources doing it. It needs to be interesting ultimately to the journal readership. There should be some novelty to it. Sometimes confirming knowledge in a new way is interesting, but new insights, building on existing knowledge, adding to the body of knowledge are things you should be striving for when you're designing your study and emphasizing when you're preparing your manuscript. Certainly it must be ethical, and this is part of any of these research studies. You need to have institutional review board approval, and that's going to be required for submitting and ultimately publishing the paper. And certainly it must be relevant, improving the understanding of the topic, inspiring authors to revisit their clinical practice or conduct more research in a related area and topic. And so you need to have a hypothesis with your study, determine the appropriate study design to answer the question. So if you want to do a comparative study and you design a level 4 study, you're not going to be able to answer your question of which implant is superior. You need to design the appropriate study beforehand and use that study design to help you answer the question and address your hypothesis. Certainly need IRB approval. You have to be doing ethical things with our research, both data and any interventions on patients, certainly in higher level studies, but really throughout studies. And you need to have a study where you can achieve a high follow-up percentage of patients. If you do a study and go through all the work, and then you get to the end and you have follow-up on 20% of patients, even 40, 50% of patients, your study has issues with statistics and bias, and the validity of the results is going to come into question through the review process, which we'll perhaps hear more about. Many journals, I believe, including JSES, are looking for 2-year clinical follow-up for most outcome measures. We can discuss if there's exceptions to this in the topic of the webinar, but this is something you often want to keep in mind for clinical follow-up. Submitting a shorter term follow-up study may run into problems in the review process. So with your research, you need to think about statistics, and you really need to think about this not as an afterthought. I think this is a very important part of preparing to write the publication. Statistics needs to be thought about from the get-go, and often a power analysis is necessary when you're determining your study design. This helps you determine the appropriate sample size so that you can hopefully address your hypothesis, and you can have a reasonable chance of determining the expected effect size. And if your study is underpowered from the get-go, a negative result can be beta error, and that's going to be a problem through the review process there. So statistics needs to be planned both into the study design, and then needs to be carefully thought out in terms of data analysis. So you need to do the right statistics to analyze the data in order for your results to be appropriate, and therefore your conclusions to be appropriate and applicable. The results have to be presented clearly so people can follow them, and ideally they could essentially reproduce the data that you're or the analysis that you're generating. Certainly there are higher level analytic methods, machine learning, et cetera, that are coming into vogue, and these present different challenges with statistics and reviewing. But for many clinical studies, these statistics are something that many readers and reviewers are very familiar with, and you need to be doing the right ones off the bat to avoid troubles. If you don't know how to do statistics, you can certainly involve a statistician. This is often a very good idea, especially as the data start to be more complex. And you want to make sure you get this right so that you can get appropriate results and conclusions to your research before you get that manuscript sent off to the journal for review. So then how do you pick the journal to submit to? This is an important process because submitting to the wrong journal, submitting an ankle article to JSES is not going to go very far unless it's a distal tibia article, I guess. But you want to really target your article and your manuscript submission to an appropriate journal. This can be a combination of talking with collaborators and mentors for their suggestions. Very important to consistently read journals in the field and note where studies tend to get published so that you can have a conversation and dialogue with existing literature in that journal that the readers and reviewers are interested in and contributes to that journal's mission. And you can look at author instructions that the journals will publish on their websites. Sometimes if your abstract is presented at a meeting, you need to make sure you're not obligated to submit somewhere. That's just an important caveat. JSES, as all others, have author instructions and aims and scope of the journal, and this is something you want to take a look at. Very important to follow journal instructions. There's detailed instructions for the journals published. JSES has a manuscript submission checklist. You can print this off and check it off. You'll avoid a lot of delays in the publication process if you do things right the first time, so that it doesn't have to get sent right back for you to redo from day one. You want a good, concise title that's informative. Your abstract should follow the appropriate guidelines and emphasize your study and findings. This is what probably many readers will skim and look at. before they decide whether or not to read the remainder of the article. So this is important to put your key points in here, key findings. And this is really the highlights of your article. The introduction should set the stage, but it's not a literature review. This has to be succinct. This has to be informative and pertinent, but it shouldn't go on and be an extensive review article. In the methods, you have to describe that research design, including how did you select your subjects? What outcomes did you collect? How did you collect those? There should be references to relevant literature if you're using existing published methodology. And you have to describe your statistical methods clearly so that others understand what you did and how you analyzed your data. IRB approval should certainly be in there as well. In the results, this should be presented, in my opinion, in a logical fashion. Tables and figures can be very powerful here for highlighting results, but not necessary to double state findings in table and a figure and in the text. You want to use those really for highlight and emphasis of key findings, because those will catch the reader's eye, and that will be very important. Discussion is where things kind of come together. So you presented your results and your findings. This is where you will summarize those key findings, important findings, and then bring it into the context of the existing literature. And you want to cite updated literature. Often many publications you'll cite will be from the journal you're submitting to, because you're doing topics of interest to that journal, but certainly throughout other journals as well. And then you want to honestly critique your manuscript with some limitations and directions for future study. So then you edit the manuscript. This shouldn't be a one draft manuscript and out the door. This needs to go through multiple rounds of revision with all the co-authors to have a high quality finished product that's ready for publication, ready for prime time. And then you submit it, you follow the instructions. You don't want to have delays where you did the page numbers wrong or the line numbers wrong. You really want to get those things as correct as you can so that things can be ready to go and you can get a good review process underway. And then you have a little bit of time to take a break. You finished your checklist. You can move on to a different project or just take a little time to relax. Often you'll come back and have a revision, and this is essentially always needed for publication in a top journal. We'll talk about that process, but don't be discouraged. Some of these are minor, some are more major, and this is something you want to take as seriously as the manuscript preparation. So I typically will review and read the comments at least several times myself. I'll discuss them with co-authors, especially the key points that are raised that require reinterpretation or reanalysis of data. And then I'll try to address as many of these comments as I possibly can, address them really completely. Sometimes you can't do everything that you want, that they want. You can't go back and change the original intervention in a study. You can add some discussion, add some of this to the limitations. But to the extent you can address their concerns appropriately, this is something that will really help to improve your manuscript and give you the best chance for acceptance. And a well-done revision often has a high chance of acceptance. I don't know the numbers on that, but I think it's if you do a good job with this and you get to the revision stage, you often have a really good shot to get your publication accepted. Not every submission gets accepted. Certainly we have emails like the bottom and your journal, your publication wasn't suited for publication in this journal. These journals can be very competitive, JSES no exception. It doesn't mean your research was invalid. It's something that you should learn from and try to incorporate the comments provided by the editors and reviewers to help improve this project that you're working on and help improve future research projects so that you can continue to do high quality studies. Sometimes there's another journal that will be targeted. There are excellent open access journals that often they can transfer the manuscript to, and JSES has several of these, which can be excellent. So I think those are often good options, but this is not failure here. If your article doesn't get accepted, you want to regroup and learn from this process. So thank you very much. look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thanks, Greg. That was great. I think couple highlighted points that I think you made very clear, which I think are critical. One is your research should be hypothesis driven, and you made that point. And I'll be honest, the number of times that is not the situation with regards to research is not infrequent. And I'll be honest, the more times that I've pushed forward or tried to get published hypothesis driven research, the higher likelihood for getting the manuscript accepted. I guess two questions for you about your own personal research and strategy. Writing. Do you have residents and fellows or other people write the manuscript, or do you write the manuscripts originally? Meaning, do you give them an opportunity to write? How does that affect the process for you? And the second thing is stats. Will you get a statistician involved every manuscript? Do you only some manuscripts? What's your strategy for yourself with both the writing aspect and the stats aspect?
So for me, I like to work with the residents and fellows on writing initial drafts of the manuscripts. Depending on your co-authors and their level of experience, this can honestly add quite a bit of time to the whole process. They haven't written as many manuscripts. The first draft or second or third draft may not be up to snuff, and you're going to have to go back to the drawing board, and I'll sit down with them and go over this and be like, we got to work on this section. I'll write out red line. I do it in Word now, but go over like, we got to work on this part. This needs to be tweaked and fine tuned. And that's really valuable for them. And so I like to really involve them in the process as much as I can. I do at this point use a statistician for any of them, just for extra backstop there. I think certain studies, if you have some expertise, you could probably be okay without it. But I just like to have, that's really their area of expertise, and I don't have a PhD in that. So I think it's nice for them to help me out.
I'd say 90% of our articles that we're publishing, we include a statistician on them at this point. Any questions, thoughts from either Serena, Andy, Peter, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the writing part of it is really interesting, what Greg said, and I think he couldn't be more right. I mean, the only way you get better at writing papers is by writing papers, and so you need that experience as a trainee, whether you're a med student or a resident. I mean, I know the first paper I wrote for Andy Green when I was a medical student came back completely red. I think there were like 2 words that he kept of the entire draft that I had written. And so the only way I got better at it was to continue to have that experience and see. He could have very easily just taken it and written the whole thing. But instead, you make comments, you let people edit, and then eventually they kind of learn the process. And then, you become faster at it too, as somebody who's reviewing their work and editing it.
I would agree with that. The more times that you edit someone else's work, you see where your own flaws in writing are. So it's a process that actually improves your own writing by actually editing someone else's manuscript. So I would agree with that. Couple of the other things I think we'll get into probably with either Serena's or Andy's talks. One of the things that I want to dig in to get Serena's thoughts is, as a reviewer, is when do you go straight up to an open access journal as opposed to going to a print journal? But Serena, why don't you pull up your talk, and maybe that can be part of the discussion. So Serena's going to give us a talk about the experiences as a reviewer as opposed to an author. Thanks.
Sure,
again, Serena.
No problem. Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Peter and Steve, for the invitation and for planning this. My disclosures are on the Academy website. But I'll give you a little bit of background on my personal experience with journals, just in general. So I'm on the board of trustees at JBJS, so that's more of like a overview kind of role, the kind of higher level vision of the journal. I'm an associate editor at Shoulder and Elbow, which is a kind of a British shoulder elbow journal. And then I'm a reviewer for multiple journals. And that list has shrunk, I would say, over time. So I definitely reviewed for more journals early on, and we can talk a little bit about that. And then I've been an author, plenty of publications and some high impact, but then plenty of low impact journals. It's like Greg said, not every publication ended up in a high impact journal. And I've learned a lot from that in terms of what reviewers are looking for, what mistakes I made initially when I formulated the study. Initially my aspirations for all the studies that I've done have been high, but some just don't pan out that way, and you end up having to accept some level of failure. So Bob and Peter asked me to talk about really three things, and so I'll focus this talk on these three topics. So how to start reviewing, if that's something that you're interested in, why you might or might not be interested in doing it. Tips for a good review, so just kind of 5-step approach to how to provide a good review to the editor. And then just some, I know Greg was going to talk about tips to write a quality paper. So I wanted to focus more on my 5 pet peeves for papers when I'm reviewing that kind of irritate me or may make me less likely to recommend for publication. So why review? I think the cons are pretty self-explanatory. I mean, one is it takes time. I mean, it's not a quick process. You have to read an article. Sometimes these are 20, 25-page articles. You're a busy person with a busy surgical practice. And so it takes you away from other things that you might want to be doing or need to be doing. It's unpaid, so you don't get paid to review articles. A lot of the other things that we do clinically or maybe interfacing with industry, we get paid for. This is not one of them. But I think there's some pros, and it's educational. You learn. I learn something every time I read an article. So I think that's obviously the number one reason to review. You get a sneak peek into what's coming. Other people may not see the article that you're going to read, and so you understand something new or innovative that may be hitting the publications. You can gain CME from certain journals to do your review, so that can be a benefit for some people that may not have a lot of CME options. And then it's an avenue to leadership. Somebody who's reading your review, that editor of the journal or the associate editor of the journal is somebody that may have a leadership position somewhere else. And if you do a good job and you do it consistently, they'll remember that, hey, so-and-so was a really good reviewer. They have a good eye for science. Maybe Bob will put him on his next webinar. So when it comes to how to get into reviewing, there are a lot of decisions that we make that are complicated. We wonder, how do we even get started to do this? Reviewing is really not one of them. I mean, this is not a hard thing to start reviewing for journals. It's pretty easy. And so there are 2 ways, really. One is they'll find you. If anybody knows this person who escaped from prison and in the Philadelphia area, was on the loose for about 2 weeks. My wife was locking all the doors and basically sleeping under the bed for a while. But they eventually found him, and they'll find you too. So if you have a particular skill set in a niche area, then a journal editor will find you to review a niche paper. If you publish a lot, then people will find you. If you were trained by somebody who's an editor of a journal, they will find you to review. So most of the time, or a lot of the time, you will be found to review and invited to review. Otherwise, you can offer your services. If you send a message to Bill Mallon or plenty of other editors of journals and you say, hey, look, I'm really interested in reviewing for you, they're very unlikely to say no. I mean, if you have some level of experience, they're very likely to say yes. And in fact, they're going to thank you for showing up and doing it, because it can be hard to find people to actually take an interest in reviewing articles. And it's such a critical part of the peer review process that you need reviewers. So, let's say you get to the point where you're suddenly reviewing, you get this email that says you've been invited to review this article, you accept it and you move on. So how do you actually do this in a efficient way? So here's just some general tips, and these are my 5 tips. And so first is, so these are just the general tips. So first is be on time. So nothing will irritate an editor more than if your review is consistently late and you have to get multiple messages. Eventually they'll get sick of you and they'll take you off of their reviewer list. You want to be complimentary to the authors. They spent a lot of time doing this research, writing the paper. They didn't write it and submit it for you to bash them and to bash their research. So the first thing you want to do is actually to be complimentary about what they did, because at some level, somebody was doing scientific work and it should be complimented. Don't be antagonistic. You may hate the topic. You may hate the study. It may be totally in the face of what you believe in. And that may be the reason why the editor picked you to review. But you don't want to be antagonistic. You want to try to review every paper in an unbiased way. and you want to provide some value to both the editor and to the authors that they submitted it. Some of these journals charge submission fees, and so you want to provide some value in your review. And if you're looking for more kind of specific tips on how to give a good review, there's actually a very nice article by Dick Brand from Core, and you can access it if you just type into Google. But it'll give you some. It doesn't mean you have to follow it exactly, but it will give you some really good tips. So when you're reviewing, you need to understand that you're really writing your review for two people. You're writing it for the editor, who wants to make a relatively quick decision about whether this paper is of interest to the readership, is of high quality, and something that should be published. And then you also want to target the author and to provide them with some context about what they did and what you think about it. So my 5-step approach is this. So my step 1 is, in my first line, I summarize the level of evidence, the study design, and the purpose. So for example, I'll say something like, this study was a level 2 single-blinded randomized controlled trial comparing positive culture rates after administration of 2 different preoperative antibiotics prior to primary shoulder arthroplasty. So that just kind of covers the level of evidence, how high quality the study was, and what they did. I'll follow that up with a summary of the key findings. So the authors found that there was no statistically significant difference in positive deep culture rates between pre-op administration of cefazolin and clindamycin. So that's the main study finding. That's what's most interesting about this study. Step 3 is I'll highlight the positives. So this is where you want to be complimentary. This is a timely study that investigates an important clinical question. The authors carefully enrolled patients and had minimal loss to follow up. These are things that Greg talked about. But this is a time to make the author feel good about themselves. And then step 4 is to highlight the weaknesses. This is where you can be critical of the paper. You can say that the study is limited by its lack of statistical power, and as a result, the negative results are hard to interpret. There was no control specimen sent. There maybe was only 1 sample sent from each patient. So this is where you highlight the critical flaws of the study, if you feel that there are any. And then step 5 is to provide your recommendation. And so you may say something like, while the study is interesting in its topic, given the lack of statistical power or the lack of control samples, I think the conclusions are difficult to interpret. And because of this, I cannot support publication. That tells the editor very directly how you feel about the paper. And then you can go on your step-by-step specific comments in a line-by-line fashion, where you can ask questions about certain lines in the paper. And obviously, you'll be maybe more thorough in this part of your review, especially if you think that this is a paper worthy of revision or worthy of acceptance. And you may be less thorough if it's a paper that you think is so fatally flawed that really cannot be considered. So the last part that I'll end with is just what makes for a good paper and my personal pet peeves. There are plenty more, but I tried to narrow it down to 5 things that I look at. And so the first is the study design has to be able to answer the study question. And so what I mean by that is, for example, if you were trying to investigate quality of sleep after rotator cuff surgery, there are different ways that you can do that, right? You could prospectively do a study where you gave patients sleep questionnaires at multiple time points after surgery, and you could prospectively collect that data. Or you could retrospectively do it if you routinely give patients a sleep survey at different time points in post-operative follow-up, and then you retrospectively look at that data that gets administered in a standardized fashion. What you wouldn't want to do is to ask patients a year after their surgery to recall how they slept, how their sleep patterns changed after surgery. So you want to make sure that your study design can actually answer the study question in a reasonable way. This is a study that John Levy published recently in JBJS that follows a very logical pattern of study design that was actually retrospective, but very well done. You need to have appropriate clinical follow-up, and I think Greg talked about this, and we can talk about this more, but it's different for different studies. If you're doing if you're trying to evaluate clinical outcomes of arthroplasty, then minimum 2 years is really what's acceptable, and that's the kind of the bare minimum. If you're looking at 30-day or 90-day complication rates, then that's a different animal. But you have to be very clear about what your study question and study purpose is. The primary study question has to be established and propered appropriately. So you want to really power your study based on the study question. I've seen plenty of papers where they power the study on something that is not necessarily the main study question. And I think that's an important thing that I look at. The data cannot be overinterpreted. And I see this a lot. You have a level 4 study that's a case series, and you make some sweeping conclusion based on a level 4 case series. And this just leaves a bad taste in the mouth of a reviewer, because you're almost insulting the intelligence that somebody can't understand that this is not a high evidence study, that you can make definitive conclusions based on it. And that may be the difference between recommendation for revision versus rejection. And then finally, I think the discussion has to be organized logically. And I think this is the hardest thing in the writing for a lot of early writers, is that their discussions are pages upon pages and pages and paragraphs upon paragraphs. And it really dilutes the importance of the paper. So the way I found it to be very helpful is to organize things based on your study questions. So the first paragraph of the discussion for me is always a summary of the study question and the main study findings that correlate directly with those study questions. The first paragraph, then I have one paragraph to discuss each of those study questions where you relate it to the literature and interpret your results. You don't go off track talking about things that you did not look to study. And then finally, it's just a limitations paragraph and a conclusion. And I think as you get better at writing, your papers actually get shorter and shorter, not longer and longer. And as a reviewer, I always respect the authors that are able to present the information that I need to know in a limited number of words, limited number of pages, and really highlight the key points. And honestly, a really great writer is Rick Mattson. So if you read a lot of his papers, they're short, they're to the point, and they just cover the study question and don't get too far into the weeds. So, I'll get off my soapbox now, and I'll let Bob and Peter take back over, but I'm interested in our discussion to follow. Thank you.
That was perfect. Thanks, Serena. That was exactly right on target of what I was hoping that we would at least start to get an idea into your mindset of how to review papers, but also kind of how to write a good paper. You talked a little bit about from a reviewer standpoint of how to become a reviewer and how to make a good review. Is there a time where you would say that how do you go about so engaging in reviews is a smart way to go about doing this, but meaning getting interested, talking to the editors. But I think giving bad reviews is probably just as harmful as not doing them at all. So a bad review can actually be more harmful to you than not reviewing, if that makes sense. Not being part of the process. And what are your thoughts with regards to the reviewer that gives a one-liner or two-liners? Because you've seen this in your own papers that you've gotten back where you see a review on it. What would you say to the audience with regards to, obviously, people that are sitting probably watching this are not going to be doing that, but do you think that what's the right way to address that as an author? I'll frame it that way for you.
Yeah, I think if that kind of a review leaks through the editorial process and to the author, then I think that leads to more headaches for the editor, because typically the author is not going to be happy with a review like that. It makes them feel like the person didn't actually understand what they were doing or take the time to read it. And I think it depends. If you have 4 reviews of your paper and 3 of them are well done and are fair and maybe didn't support it, but at least it looked like they took the time to evaluate it, then as an author, I think you just understand that reviewer didn't really do their job. Maybe they're up against the time frame or something, and you let it go. But if there are 2 reviews and that was used to make a decision on your paper, then as an author, you're going to feel like the just process was not followed. Typically, you'll send a respectful email to the editor. It leads to more headache for the editor. And then usually as that reviewer, you've not only not given a good review, but you've also made the editor do more work, and they're already swamped with things. So likely you're not going to get invited to do much more after that interaction.
Okay. And I asked the question specifically because you as the author getting that, do you just let that slide? Do you write a letter to the editor? What's been your experience with that? And because I've seen it myself, and sometimes there's a balance as the the purpose of this webinar is how do we get our research published, and do you push the editor to try to say, please re-review this manuscript, please go back, dig in, or when do you say, okay, I'm going to peel off, I'm going to accept this, and then I'm going to maybe move to another journal? What's your strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I look at the other reviews and I say, okay, a lot of the things that were commented on, we can correct. And I have one review that just wrote off the paper without any real comments, then at that point, I'll reach out to the editor, because I think that we can address the actual critiques that were made just in a just way in those good reviews. But if I feel like, even those comments, I can't really address them well, and I have this one kind of bad review that is only 1 line or 2 lines, then I'll just eat that and move on, because I haven't really seen that you can usually, if the editor let it go through, then that usually means that the editor didn't want to publish it anyway. And so, I haven't had great success doing that.
Okay. I'm going to circle back to the question before I get to Andy that I asked that I was going to get to. Going to a different, online, a lower impact journal to start. What is kind of your reasoning strategy from a publication standpoint that you'll decide that you want to go straight to a lower impact journal?
I think you have to be critical of what your product is. I mean, I think, you don't, if you know that your research is flawed, and the more research you do, the more quickly you can identify if your research has some flaws in it. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not worthy of publication. It may still add value, but it's just, you have to be realistic about where that study could get published. And so, even though I personally will set out to write every paper and to start every study as if it could be quality enough for JBJS or JSES or a high tier journal, sometimes it doesn't turn out that way. And so just because that was your initial goal doesn't mean you need to waste your time, the reviewer's time, and the journal's time, and sometimes your money submitting it to that type of place. So, I think as an author, it's important to have certain journals that you consider to be lower tier and that your study may be appropriate for. And whether that's open access or whether it's not open access, I think is up for debate.
Okay, great. It's perfect. Any other questions for Serena?
So in your opinion as a reviewer, what would be the statistical mistakes that you think will make paper unacceptable or unpublishable at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think the things that we see that are one is power. If something is grossly underpowered and the results are negative, then that's just a hard study to look favorably upon. The second is fragility. So, if you have positive results, but your numbers were such that, 1 or 2 people in each cohort switching would have totally made your results negative, then I think that's another thing that you look at it from a statistical standpoint. I'm not good enough from a statistical standpoint to really, harp on somebody's multiple regression analysis or something more complex than that. So as a reviewer that's not a statistical reviewer, I'm looking more at power and fragility.
And that's the benefit of having a stats editor that can then dig into those issues with regards to, and I know Andy has used it, I've used it as an editor, that having someone that with an experience in statistics to be able to assist you making the decision with regards to the finer aspects of the methods that were actually performed is definitely helpful. What do you think about 2-year follow-up? Just, I mean, and this is this is a touchy subject, and I think I just want to, there are people that are hopefully going to be watching this is like, well, I've got 1.5 year follow-up, or I'm gonna, it's like, where do you draw the line with regards to 2, and how have you found as a reviewer of you reviewing papers, is that a hard line in the sand that you'll say reject? And similarly, as the author submitting articles, have you submitted articles with less than 2 year? So are you kind of maybe submitting some things that you might necessarily as a reviewer reject?
Yeah, so I've definitely had papers that had less than 2-year follow-up, and I think that the argument for why that's okay is that, frankly, a lot of our clinical outcomes don't change between year 1 and 2 in terms of patient-reported outcomes. So I think there's an argument that you can make there, but I think at some point you have to draw a line and you have to know where the game is played. And so when I have a paper where I have less than 2-year follow-up and it's an arthroplasty study, and my main study question was to evaluate patient-reported outcomes, I know that that's not getting in a higher tier journal. So that will get submitted somewhere else. If it's if I'm looking at radiographic results and I have 2-year outcomes, then that's good, but frankly, I mean, that's probably not enough for a lot of the things that we're looking at in terms of outcomes and survival of total shoulder. So I mean, there's some papers that frankly 2-year outcome is probably not enough.
Yep.
But I mean, I can understand the argument both ways. For me personally, if I think the study is really good and they had a minimum follow-up of 1.5 years for some patients, then I'll make a comment in the review that I think they should try to wait, 6 months or whatever it is, and try to get that additional follow-up on those patients, because the study has value and they still need to understand that that's the threshold that's currently set.
Okay, that's perfect. All right, thanks, Serena. That was great. Andy, if you could pull up your slides, that'll be great. And so we're going to now kind of take the perspective from the editor. So probably incorporating a lot of the things that both Greg and Serena have talked about, but then looking at it from a higher level. So thanks again, Andy.
So can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Great. So first, Bob and Peter, thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to give my perspective. I have to say, Greg and Serena covered a lot of what I have in mind, so we'll see if I can get through this fairly quickly. But the two of them are, and also Bob, are outstanding reviewers, and my experience with them has been really great. Let's see, there we go. So here are my disclosures. I'm a former deputy editor of Shoulder and Elbow for Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery. I'm on the board of trustees of Journal of Shoulder and Elbow Surgery, and the reviewer for multiple journals. I couldn't even think of all of them. But just as introduction background, my perspective as an editor is a reflection of my role as a reviewer, writer, and researcher prior to becoming an editor. However, my current role as a reviewer, writer, and researcher, as I'm no longer an editor, was also shaped by my experience as an editor. So I think we learned from the whole process. I remember, in junior high and high school and college, I really didn't like writing. I wasn't that good at it. I never really quite understood the organizational component, but becoming a scientific writer helped me a lot. And reviewing other people's work and editing helped me to become a better writer as well, to kind of finalize my research. These are really my generalized thoughts. I'm going to try to limit my formal comments to the role of an editor in the process of research publication. So I just thought I'd look up the word editor because I wanted to make sure I understood what we all understand. And so an editor is someone who edits, especially as an occupation. That's not really what we do as journal editors, but to some extent. But I think the verb to edit is probably more relevant, and that's to prepare something as a literary material for publication or a public presentation, to direct the publication of, because in some ways an editor is in charge of what a journal's mission is and helps direct that. The deleting, that's part of the mechanical part of editing. And then that last part, that's a new part of the definition for editing in Merriam-Webster's dictionary, but that's not relevant to what we do. I have a lot of experience with a museum, and I work with curators, and in many respects, an editor of a journal is a curator. And a curator acquires, cares for, and develops a collection. So depending on the journal focus and the audience, the editor will have a particular direction or philosophy of how to, get the right research into the journal that they want and how to present it. The short answer is to my initial question is, what does a journal editor do? The goal is to get the best research available into the journal that you're editing, to curate it the way you would like it to be curated. But the reality is, what you get is the best research available to you. And it's also the best research you can get. So depending on what journal you're in, what level it is, you may not get the best research, but you're getting something that has a scientific basis. There are many venues for publication. I think that's important for authors to understand. Not all research gets put in the best journal or the highest impact journal, and not all of the best research gets into the highest impact journals. Some of the best research ends up somewhere else. So the researcher and author should focus on optimizing all aspects of their work, and then it should stand on its merits. And I think especially Greg outlined a lot of key points on how to think about doing research, how to put it together, how to present it, and then to get it published. And then Serena kind of summarized what the review process is looking for. What are we looking for? Topics of current interest. Is the research or the subject novel or innovative? Are there previous similar publications so that this is just repeating something that was done before? Or is it similar but different and better? How is it different from previous work? Does the work add to our understanding of clinical medicine or basic science? And will it affect clinical practice? Is this a study that's just well done but irrelevant? Maybe it doesn't then belong in the highest impact journal. Or is it really relevant? And sometimes something that's very relevant might not be the best study construct, but it still could be very important. I'm going to kind of go through this way I think about it as an editor and as a reviewer, because I think those roles kind of intermingle, but you really need to have strong and appropriate methodology. What I learned is, as being a reviewer and editor, was you really need to quickly read the abstract, get a sense of what this is all about, and then I go to the methodology, because if the methodology is not good, then the study is not going to be good, and that really knocks it down. So you have to have a good study question and hypothesis. It's very common for someone to submit a paper without a hypothesis, and I'll often, as a reviewer, say, well, was there a hypothesis for this study? Because sometimes the study's just done and it becomes a data mining venture, and not just driven by the hypothesis. And a lot of times you may have a hypothesis at the beginning, and then after you've analyzed the data, other aspects come up, and that's part of it. But you can't just start a study for no good reason. Is the study design appropriate for the research question? I think Greg touched on that. And avoid or recognize potential biases. There are often many biases, predominantly in selection, but also in treatment, that a lot of authors don't quite recognize as they're putting together their manuscript or after having done the research. Statistics, it's no longer just t-tests and p-values. Statistics is far more sophisticated. I think if you review orthopedic literature, we've really made great leaps and bounds to become much more sophisticated in analyzing the data. And I think it's really important to consult with a statistician. It may be something that you don't need a statistician for, but I think it's still a good idea to consult with a statistician when you're doing a research project, unless it's a very basic case series. But if you're doing any kind of analysis, you need to have a statistician help you to ensure that you're using the right methodology. The results are what you get, and they're important in the context of the hypothesis and the methodology. You can't really change the results. It is what you have, but results have to be viewed within these contexts. And then there's the discussion. This discussion, I think, was outlined nicely, especially by Serena, but the discussion needs to synthesize the results into a coherent and meaningful story for the reader. I think it's really important in research to provide some conceptual understanding of the research and the topic, and not just report the results. I think it's very important to have an understanding of that. Not all, you can't say that 95% of patients did well, but really to delve deeper and to understand why certain patients did well or why they did not. And then lastly, this is a pet peeve of mine, is the conclusion supported by the results? It's very common for authors to write a conclusion that really isn't supported by the results of their study. And not just to use your conclusion to reiterate the results, but to to think about the results and come up with, is there something that we can conclude as a result of this research? As an editor, you're selecting reviewers. I think Serena touched on that nicely, but what I'm looking for is someone who's interested, diligent, thoughtful, and thorough, and knowledgeable of the subject. And you can volunteer to be a reviewer. And when that occurs, often what I did in the past was I would assign them an article as maybe the fourth reviewer, so that if they weren't very good at it, I wouldn't have to count on it. And then the question that came up was, what do you do with bad reviewers? I think there are opportunities, especially for younger reviewers, where an editor can educate the reviewer on the process, that to help them understand how to go about it and how to do a good job. And then interestingly, some of the most accomplished and prolific researchers and authors are not always the best reviewers. And it's counterintuitive, but I think as an editor, you learn who's good and who isn't. So journal reviewing, I think in general, we strive to make it a really good process, but sometimes it's imperfect. I think the issue of, well, I have a really good study, but it didn't get into JSES. Not everything gets into JSES. There's a lot more research being done, a lot more publications, a lot more venues now. It is a peer review process. So the process of review isn't just accept or reject, it's peer review. And I think one thing we really need to be cognizant of and emphasize is that the goal of reviewing is to make research better, even for those who you're rejecting. So that, as Serena pointed out, it's really helpful to an author and researcher to give a good review, even for something that's not going to get accepted. It helps them to be better in the future. It helps them to get it published somewhere else. So I think that's an important point that often gets kind of overlooked. I think editors are invaluable, important, some perhaps underappreciated, especially when you have someone who's unhappy with with the decision they've received. I think as an editor, you kind of learn how to deal with those people. You definitely don't want to write a nasty letter to the editor, just complaining or discrediting the review process. That doesn't get you anywhere. You can be very tactful about a letter if you're going to write a letter to the editor, and that may help you get through the process. The editor requires and benefits from the input and assistance of reviewers, authors, and readership. So I think having worked with people like Greg and Serena and Bob and many other people in the process, you understand how important it is to get impact and input and assistance from them, and it makes you a better editor. So thank you for your attention, and be happy to answer any questions relevant to this.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. That was actually, it was great. It highlighted the things in the first two talks that needed to be highlighted, which is great. You talked again about the importance with regards to creating the study appropriately, statistics, how critical that is, performing hypothesis-driven research, and then just from organizational skills, being able to write something that is actually readable. I think those are all really important things that, unfortunately, people that are submitting manuscripts, and I see this now from being on the editor side, is that you can get a very well done study, a performed study. You can have several reviews that are excellent, that really help out the review process. But if the manuscript is written very poorly, it can become something that is on the bubble, or reject. And because of the amount of work that is required to push that manuscript into something that is publishable. And it's unfortunate. And for me, I know that it's going to be, it's good. I will work through those manuscripts, but it really is dependent upon the editor that's actually on the other side of the seat, that you could have a really great study, reviewers that do a great job and think that it's actually valuable research, but it doesn't get accepted because of the amount of work that's required to be able to get over the threshold of getting it into a publishable form. And I think you've seen that. I know that you've worked through those manuscripts, but I think a take home for some of the people that are actually on this webinar would be if you don't know how to write a manuscript appropriately, but you've done great science and you've actually got reviewers or you think that will be reviewed well, have someone help you write the manuscript so that from the editor's standpoint, that part of it is much easier. It would be interesting to know how you have responded to unhappy authors and what was your strategy, and maybe that would then give authors advice to be able to navigate a correspondence with the editor that might be fruitful for them.
So fortunately, I haven't had to do that very often, but there are some authors who are well known for responding to negative decisions. And I think that as an editor, if it was a manuscript that was pretty good, maybe it was on the bubble, and you get a really well written, tactful, respectful letter, you're more likely to think about it again and maybe send it out for more reviews. So that's a tool that an editor has. You can go through the first round of reviews, you're not quite sure, and then you can decide, you know what, I'll get 3 other people to review this paper, and that may help you decide one way or the other. I know some journals have workshops where there are papers that are on the bubble or controversial, and you get even more reviewers, and that ends up being unless JBJS was the associate editors became involved in that, and that can help as well. For the person who writes a really nasty letter,
Yep.
One thing that I found was it wasn't a bad idea for me to contact an editor from another journal who might know that person, just to get gauge, is that the way they are. And a lot of times it happens to be the personality of that person, and you just you move on. You figure, I'm doing the best I can, and I can't please everybody, and they must have had a bad day.
Sure.
And
Leave it at that.
and there's other places to go, and the worst thing to do is you don't want to write back and get into a cat fight about it. Just let it
go. I got 1 or 2 more questions, but anyone on the panel have questions for Andy?
I had to giggle when Serena talked about all the rewriting, because anyone who's submitted a paper that I got a hold of, there's a lot of editing. But I think one thing advice that I could, and I've worked with a lot of medical students and residents and fellows, one advice I could give for writing is there's some basic aspects of style that come into play that aren't necessarily scientific, but they make your manuscript much easier to read and understand and clearer. Strunk and White is a book that I think I was given in junior high and high school. It's kind of the basics, how to write in an active voice rather than passive voice. It can help you with the wordiness, and then to think about, especially the discussion, as you write a paragraph, does your paragraph stick to what the first sentence is? And these are basic writing skills that if you understand that and you pay attention, can make the process of writing easier, and also the process of getting accepted easier. Because if a paper is disorganized and not well written, it doesn't really, that really detracts from the research question itself.
Great. It's great advice. I would say that is, I struggle from it from a reviewer standpoint. Sometimes I'm like, what Serena has mentioned is that as a reviewer, if you see so much of this going on, it makes oftentimes your review very short because, you don't necessarily want to, if 90% of the manuscript needs to be re-edited or edited because of that, then as a reviewer, you're not going to do that a lot of times. But some of the issues is then if it actually is good science and potentially would have impact in our clinical care, someone's got to do that. And that then falls upon, honestly, the editor's hands to be able to do that. And I would just emphasize to the people that are watching that the lower amount of that the editor needs to do, the happier that the editor is going to be in the process of making a decision about accepting or rejecting. We see this not infrequently, and it's hard with international papers. So where English is a second language. And I know that Andy will see this as well, and that it can be challenging because that some of the science is just amazing, but it's struggling through the grammar where every sentence needs to be corrected, and that it can be really challenging.
The other interesting experience I've had is you have a study that you think is well done, but the authors really haven't interpreted the data correctly. And I've done that where I've sent it back to the authors and say, you have to redo the statistics. The topic is of great interest, but you haven't really done the study right. And if you can do that, then we'll reconsider it. Because I recognize that there's something there, but I can't take it the way it is now. And, maybe if I'd been involved in the study, I would have done it differently. And if they can, but I wasn't. But if they can do that, that might give them a second chance.
Sure. Okay. That's great. That's perfect. Any other closing thoughts on tonight's webinar? Again, I want to thank Greg, Serena, Andy for taking their time out tonight. I think this has been exactly what I was hoping that we would be able to actually get through. And I think it's hopefully given a little bit of a playbook for people as they start to consider submitting and hopefully getting a higher acceptance rate on their manuscripts to be able to facilitate the process. So again, I wanted to thank Smith and Nephew for sponsoring tonight's webinar. We truly appreciate that. And please look out for the future for further research webinar series that will be coming up starting in 2024. So again, thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Good night,
Thanks,
everyone.
Bob.
Thanks, Bob.
Peter.
Steve, thanks.
Thanks, Steve.
Yep. Have a good night, all.
Okay, bye-bye.